There is a throne aboard the strike cruiser Righteous Fury that no one sits in anymore. It is not empty because the ship lacks a commander. It is not empty because it is broken or decommissioned or sealed behind a locked bulkhead that no one has the authority to open. It is empty because the man who sat in it has been removed, not just from the ship, not just from the company, but from the record, from memory, from the category of things the Imperium is willing to acknowledge having made. The nameplate is still there. They did not bother to remove it. In the economy of erasure, a nameplate is beneath notice. It reads, Captain Titus, 2nd Company, Ultramarines. If you ask the warriors who walk past it every day whether they notice it, most of them would say no, and they would be telling the truth. The human mind, even the enhanced, rebuilt, surgically perfected mind of an Adeptus Astartes, is extraordinarily skilled at not seeing the things that make it uncomfortable to look. So the nameplate remains, and the throne remains empty, and the ship continues its eternal work in the Emperor's name, crewed by men who have never been told what happened to the man whose name is bolted to the wall in a corridor near the bridge, and who have learned, through the particular instinct that develops in institutions that punish curiosity, not to ask. I want you to hold that image for a moment. The empty throne, the nameplate, the corridor that no one lingers in. Now I want to ask you a question. The question that this entire story is built around. The question I will not be able to answer for you until we have walked every step of the road that leads to it. What does a man become when the only thing that ever defined him was his willingness to serve, and the thing he served decided he never existed? Take your time with it. We have a long road ahead. His name was Demetrian Titus, and he was born in a world with no glory in it. That should have saved him. In the Imperium of man, that vast, grinding, 10,000-year machine of war and faith and administrative cruelty, the worlds that produce heroes are specific kinds of worlds. Death worlds, where children learn to kill before they learn to walk. Hive worlds, where the pressure of 100 million lives stacked on top of each other produces, in the rare individual, something diamond-hard and brilliant. Feudal worlds, where the mythology of strength and honor is breathed in from birth like air. Tarantis was none of these things. Tarantis was an agri-world in the Mausolei system, deep within the realm of Ultramar, and its entire purpose in the Imperium's vast economy was to grow food. Not to fight, not to produce warriors or scholars or priests or heroes. To grow food, to sustain the populations of systems that mattered more, to function. Picture it. A desert world, not the romantic kind, not the endless golden dunes of a feral world where young men test their courage against the landscape. A working desert, utilitarian. The kind of desert that is simply there, simply dry, simply present in the way that a tool left on a workbench is present. Without meaning, without grandeur, serving its purpose and nothing more. The moisture traps dotted the landscape in rows, squat mechanical towers pulling water from air too thin and too hot to seem like it contained any, feeding it down into the domed agri-cities that clustered along the few stable tectonic zones. Those domed cities, you need to understand them to understand the man. They were not beautiful, they were not proud, they were functional, sealed against the heat and the dust and the radiation that the sun pushed through Tarantis' inadequate atmosphere, lit from within by recessed lumens that approximated sunlight badly enough to grow crops, but not quite well enough to feel like day. The people who lived inside them worked in shifts, maintaining the irrigation systems and the soil processors and the protein vat farms that fed 100 million mouths on worlds they would never visit. They did this without complaint, because complaint accomplished nothing. They did this without expectation of recognition, because recognition did not come from working the moisture traps on a secondary agri-world. They did this because the system required it of them. The system worked. That was the fact that shaped everything. On Tarantis, the system, imperial administration, agricultural quotas, distribution schedules, the whole vast clockwork of it, functioned. Food was grown, taxes were paid, tithes were met. The PDF maintained order without excessive brutality. The administratum representatives were corrupt, but not catastrophically so. Children were born, educated to the degree the system required, and assigned to functions the system needed. They grew old doing those functions and died having done them, and the system continued, indifferent to any individual contribution, but wholly dependent on the collective one. To a certain kind of mind, this is bleak. To the kind of mind that was being formed on Tarantis during the years we are concerned with, it was simply reality. And reality, the boy who would become Titus understood very early, is not bleak or beautiful. It simply is. And the only question of any worth is, what is your function within it? He was 8 years old when he first asked that question. Not aloud, not to anyone, but to himself, in the way that certain children conduct an interior life of such richness and seriousness that their outward silence is frequently mistaken for stupidity. His family were crop technicians, 4th generation, responsible for maintaining the soil processes in Dome 7 of the Primus Agri complex. His father was competent. His mother was more than competent. She had a gift for the mechanical systems that she was never given the tools to develop into anything larger than an expertise in moisture trap calibration. His world was maintenance rotors and shift changes and the particular silence of domed spaces at the hours when one shift had gone to sleep and the next had not yet woken. He was not unhappy. That is important to say, because the easy narrative is the boy who suffered and was rescued and is therefore grateful. That boy is not the tragedy. Titus was not unhappy. He was, there is no better word for it, settled. He had the interior stillness of a person who has understood, very early, that the universe is indifferent to his feelings about it, and has made peace with that indifference, and moved on to the more interesting question of what to do with the time available. The scouts found him when he was 12. They came through Dome 7 as part of a standard recruitment circuit. A veteran scout named Matoras and 2 of his initiates running assessment protocols through the lower agri-complexes of Tarantis' northern hemisphere. They were not expecting to find anything remarkable. Tarantis was a low-probability world. Its children were, on average, physically adequate and psychologically compliant. Acceptable raw material, but rarely exceptional. They found the boy in the access tunnels beneath Soil Processor Grid 14. He had been down there, alone, without permission, without any particular authorization, because a coupling in one of the secondary feed lines had been making a noise he did not recognize, and he had decided to find out what was causing it. He was not supposed to be in the access tunnels. He was not supposed to be doing maintenance unsupervised. He was 12 years old and entirely unconcerned by both of these facts. Matoras' initiate found him first, coming around a corner in the low-ceiling tunnel with his lumen raised, and the boy looked up from where he was crouched over the opened coupling housing, tools arranged in precise order beside him on the floor, and met the initiate's eyes without flinching, without surprise, without the fear that every child shows when confronted with a figure 3 times their size, in full scout armor, in a confined space. He simply looked, assessed, and said with the particular gravity of a 12-year-old who has learned that questions are more efficient than reactions, "Is there something wrong with the secondary systems on this level? I thought it was just the coupling, but if you're running a diagnostic circuit." The initiate called for Matoras. Matoras studied the boy for a long time. He noted the tools arranged in order. He noted the diagnostic notation the boy had made in a small data slate propped against the pipe housing. Neat, systematic, more methodical than most adult technicians managed. He noted the absence of fear. And then he asked the boy a question that would change the course of his life. "Are you afraid of me?" The boy considered it with evident seriousness. Then, "No. Should I be?" Matoras, according to the records he later filed, identified 3 qualities in that moment that he had spent a career looking for in combination. The absence of performative courage. The boy was not pretending not to be afraid to impress him. The absence of genuine fear. He had assessed the situation and reached a conclusion. And the precision of the question that followed. Should I be? Not why would I be? Not of course not. But a genuine inquiry into whether his assessment was correct. A child with no fear, the narrator notes, is one of 2 things. It is either a child with the rare gift of accurate perception, a child who looks at danger and sees it clearly and evaluates it correctly and responds proportionally, or it is a child who has been so thoroughly taught that their feelings are irrelevant to function, that the feeling of fear has simply been rerouted, buried, placed somewhere it will not interfere with the work. Matoras chose not to ask which. Perhaps he knew the answer would complicate things. Perhaps, in the calculating mathematics of a veteran scout selector, it didn't matter. Either kind of child would make a space marine. Either kind of child would serve. He filed the recommendation that evening. What happened next is not a story of triumph. I want you to resist the version of this that feels like triumph. The selection trials, the surgeries, the transformation. There is a way of telling those years that makes them heroic. That makes the audience lean forward and feel the excitement of a boy becoming more than a boy. The chapter historians tell it that way. The recruitment chapels on Macraga show it that way in their frescoes. Young men ascending, light pouring from the apothecarian doors, the chapter master's hand raised in blessing over the newly made warriors. That is the story the Imperium wants you to receive. I am going to give you the other one. The trials lasted 14 months. Of the 63 boys from the Mausolée system who were tested alongside him, 41 did not survive the physical assessments. Not failed, did not survive. This is a thing the Ultramarines acknowledge without ceremony, because it is simply true. The gene seed is selective, and the trials are designed to discover its limits, and its limits are discovered through stress applied to breaking point. And sometimes the breaking point is fatal. 11 more were eliminated in the psychological evaluations. 5 were removed at the genetic compatibility stage. 3 passed everything, and were nevertheless rejected for reasons that were never recorded in any file accessible to anyone below a certain clearance. 3 boys, who did everything asked of them, were turned away without explanation, and returned to the worlds they had come from. Titus did not ask why. He was aware that the 3 boys had been sent home. He filed the information. He continued. The assessors noted in the records that would later be examined with such terrible thoroughness that he stood out in a specific way. Not in his performance. His scores were exceptional but not unprecedented, but in his response to the process. Where other candidates who survived the early trials showed some combination of relief and pride and renewed vigor, Titus showed a quality the assessors struggled to name. One wrote, "Candidate processes each completed trial as a unit of data rather than an achievement. Moves immediately to preparation for the following unit without evident celebration or recovery time. Recommend evaluation for abnormal affect suppression." The recommendation was reviewed and dismissed. Affect suppression was not a disqualifying characteristic in candidates for the Adeptus Astartes. Quite the reverse. The surgeries began when he was 13. I will not tell you all of them. There are 9 organs implanted in sequence during the making of a space marine. the Biscopea, the Hemastamen, the Laraman's organ, the catalepsian node, the preomnor, the omophagea, the multilung, the oculobe, the Lyman's ear, and these are only the beginning. This is before the Becher's gland, before the Suzanne membrane, before the neuroglottis, before the melanchromic organ, the oolitic kidney, the neuroglottis, organ after organ, surgery after surgery, each one changing the chemistry of what he was, altering the baseline of his perception and his body, and, gradually, the baseline of his self. Here is what the records do not tell you about those surgeries, what the recruitment frescoes do not show. The boy from Tarantis, the one who crouched in access tunnels listening to the particular complaint of a faulty coupling, who arranged his tools in order, who squinted in the unfiltered light of the desert on the rare days when maintenance work took him outside the dome. That boy had specific things about him. The way he squinted, specifically, a habitual scrunch of the left eye more than the right, from spending his early years on whichever side of the moisture traps caught the direct sun. Calloused hands, not the uniform calluses of a warrior, but the particular ones of a child who spent years on the specific tools of soil processing, harder on the outer palm and the second and third fingers of the right hand. A way of going still when he was thinking, a complete physical stillness that his mother had learned to recognize as concentration rather than absence. The first surgery took the squint. The multi-lung implantation changed the musculature of his chest and upper back in ways that rewired the habitual posture he had carried since childhood. The melanchromic organ changed the quality of his skin. The Biscopea rebuilt his bone density over 14 months of agony that he bore in silence because he had been told silence was expected, and he had been built by Tarantis to meet expectations without complaint. By the end of the second year of surgery, his hands no longer carried the calluses of soil processing. They carried the calluses of a different life entirely. No one grieved this. It was not the kind of thing anyone thought to grieve. He was becoming a space marine. He was becoming something extraordinary, something almost mythological, a defender of humanity, a warrior of the Emperor. The boy he had been was an acceptable cost, but the boy had existed. He had been real. He had squinted at the desert sun and listened to the sound of a coupling that wasn't quite right, and asked without performance or fear whether there was something wrong with the secondary systems. That boy did not walk out of the apothecarium. What walked out was taller by almost 3 feet. What walked out had a second heart, and bones reinforced with ceramic composites, and muscles that could exert force sufficient to tear apart the armor plating of a light vehicle. What walked out had reflexes calibrated to a standard of response time that made baseline human perception look geological in its slowness. What walked out was magnificent. What walked out was exactly what the Ultramarines had built it to be. What walked out would spend the next 150 years in service to the Imperium that had built it, and then another 100 years in a cell, being asked to explain itself, and then a choice that the story has not yet reached, a choice that requires everything that comes between to make sense of. The boy who would have made that choice differently, the boy with the squint and the calloused hands and the silence that meant thinking, he was gone. He had been replaced by something that the Imperium understood how to use. The Imperium would later discover that it did not, in fact, understand, that there was something in what it had made that exceeded its taxonomy, that its own process had produced an outcome it could not classify. But that discovery was still a long way off. He served. That is the simple version. He served, and he was exceptional at serving, and in an institution that values exceptional service, this produced results. Within 50 years, an unremarkable span for a baseline human, a comparatively brief span for a being who might live for centuries, he had risen to a position of decorated distinction within the Second Company. Not through politics, not through proximity to powerful men, not through the careful accumulation of favors and alliances that constitute a career in most institutions, through service, through the quality of work, through the specific excellence of a man who treats every assignment as the most important assignment he has ever received, because to treat it as anything less would be to disrespect the emperor whose work it is. This needs to be said clearly, because the story that follows can create the impression of a man who was somehow naive, who simply didn't understand how institutions worked, who was blindsided by a system he should have recognized earlier. That is not the truth. Titus understood how institutions worked. He was not naive. He was something harder to protect against. He was principled. He genuinely believed, not as performance, not as the surface expression of deeper ambition, but as a core operating value, that excellence was its own argument, that doing the work well was sufficient, that the codex astartes was not a political instrument but a moral one, and that a man who followed it in spirit as well as letter would in the end be judged fairly by an institution built on those same principles. He was, in this belief, entirely correct about what the Ultramarines were supposed to be. He was catastrophically wrong about the resilience of that ideal under pressure. Consider the contrast that chapter historians would later note with some significance. Cato Sicarius. Sicarius was born to a noble lineage of Ultramar, raised in the architecture of recognition and rank, constitutionally incapable, at least in his formative decades of service, of completing an action without being aware of how that action would be perceived by those with the power to advance him. He needed the glory. He required it, the way certain organisms require specific minerals, not for luxury, but for function. Without the acknowledgement, something in him ran at diminished capacity. The histories record that Sicarius had to learn humility, that the chapter master worked on him over decades, gradually teaching him to set aside the need for personal distinction in service of the collective mission, that this was genuine growth, hard-won, real. What the histories note less often is that Titus never needed that lesson. He arrived without the wound it addresses. He did not seek recognition, because recognition to him was simply not a category of meaningful reward. He was rewarded by the work. He was rewarded by the objective completed, the mission successful, the brother brought home, the line held. First Captain Agamemnon noticed it. Calgar noticed it. They saw in him the thing they were always trying to build, the living argument that the codex's values were not a discipline but a nature, that a man could be born to them rather than bent toward them. They were proud of him, in the particular way that engineers are proud of something that exceeds the design specifications. They would not, when it mattered, be able to protect him. Not because they were cowards, and not entirely because they were unwilling, but because the mechanism that came for him was not one that Calgar's rank, or Agamemnon's reputation, or any arrangement of institutional goodwill could reach. The mechanism had already been built. It was already running. Titus simply hadn't encountered it yet. In the 43rd year of his service, a routine administrative visit brought a mid-ranking inquisitorial assessor to the fortress of Hera on Macraga. His name is not recorded in any file that survives. His rank was unremarkable. His purpose officially was audit compliance, a review of the chapter's record-keeping practices in relation to cross-agency intelligence sharing during the aftermath of the First Tyrannic War. He was at the fortress for 11 days. He reviewed records. He attended 2 formal dinners. He inspected the memorial rolls of the first company terminators who had died on the polar fortresses of Macraga, and he stood before the wall of names for a long time, though no one who observed him could determine whether the time he spent there was reverence or assessment. On his 8th day, he watched a training exercise in the lower fortress yards. Several sergeants of the second company were running their squads through close quarters engagement protocols. The assessor stood at the observation rail for 3 hours. When he returned to his quarters that evening, he opened a working document that no one aboard the Fortress of Hera knew he was compiling and added a single line. The line read, "Ultramarines, 2nd Company, Sergeant Titus, exceptional. Recommend monitoring." He did not elaborate. He did not explain what had drawn his attention, what specific quality had warranted the notation, what the monitoring was intended to establish or to guard against. The file was closed and transmitted to an address in the Inquisitorial administrative network that would, under normal circumstances, be reviewed at periodic intervals by a mid-level analyst and either escalated or archived depending on subsequent developments. Under normal circumstances, it would likely have been archived. There was nothing in the line to justify urgency. Exceptional was a description, not an indictment. Recommended monitoring was, in inquisitorial parlance, approximately 1 step above nothing of note on the scale of concern. Under normal circumstances, the file would have sat in that archive for decades, accumulating bureaucratic dust until the analyst responsible for it retired or was reassigned, and the file passed to a successor who would review it, note its age and the absence of subsequent entries, and mark it dormant. Under normal circumstances, a single line about an exceptional sergeant who had done nothing wrong would have amounted to nothing at all. The Imperium's memory, however, is longer than its mercy. Titus never knew the file existed. He walked back to his duties after the training exercise with his mind on a tactical problem his squad had not yet solved to his satisfaction, a specific movement pattern that he believed could be improved. And the assessor watched him go and made his notation and closed his document and thought nothing more about it. The file was waiting. The file would keep waiting, patient as stone, for decades. For decades, Titus continued to serve. He continued to be exceptional. He continued to refuse recognition. He continued to embody every principle the Ultramarines claimed to value most. The file waited. Somewhere above the forge world of Greya, an orbital spire rises through the ash-choked atmosphere like an accusation. You don't need to know about it yet. You only need to know that it exists, that it will matter. By the time this story reaches it, you will understand exactly what it cost to stand at its summit, and exactly what it cost to survive doing so. Everything you have just heard, every year on Tarantis, every surgery, every decade of faultless service, every battle, every commendation, every decision made in accordance with the codex and the chapter's values, and the honest best judgment of a man who was built to serve, and served without corruption. All of it was the setup. What happened on Greya was the trigger, and what happened after? What happened in the decades that followed, in the silence that swallowed his name, in the cell that had no windows, and the questions that had no right answers, and the 100 years that the Imperium has never once been asked to account for. That was the Imperium being exactly what it was built to be. The question is whether that makes it forgivable. We'll come back to that. Chapter 2. The Cost of Excellence. The ambush has already started by the time we arrive. That is how it works, with ambushes designed by people who know what they are doing. There is no moment of transition, no clear before and after that you can point to and say, here is where it began. There is only the sudden, total reality of it, arriving fully formed, and the gap between knowing and acting that separates the warriors who survive from the ones who don't. Titus heard it before he saw it. Not the ambush on Beta Arcturus, not yet. We will get there. What he heard in the 3 seconds between the Vox burst that changed everything and the moment his body began moving toward it was something quieter than sound, something interior, a thing leaving him, some quality he had carried without naming for 50 years of service, some certainty about the shape of the world, some assumption so fundamental He had never needed to examine it, because it had never been threatened. He would not find a name for what left him in those 3 seconds until much later. Until a room with no windows, and a question asked 4,000 times in the dark. Until a century had passed, and the cell had taken everything it was going to take, and left behind only the things it couldn't reach. He did not know, on Beta Arcturus, that the thing leaving him was the last moment of his life, in which the Imperium was still the thing he believed it to be. He heard the ambush. He began moving, and the world, without ceremony or warning, became a different place than it had been 3 seconds before. But before the ambush, there was Trajan. There is always, in the life of a man shaped by service, someone who comes before, someone who shows him what the function looks like when it is performed at its highest level, not the theoretical ideal of the codex, not the formal standards of the chapter, but the living version, warm, fallible, present, real. For Titus, that person was Captain Lucian Trajan of the Second Company, and I want to give him the space he deserves before I tell you how he died, because the dead deserve to be known before they are mourned. Trajan was not a subtle man. He did not have the political instincts that certain captains cultivated, the ability to read a room, to understand the weight of an institutional relationship, to move pieces on the board of chapter politics with the patience of a man who thinks in decades. He had other qualities, a directness so absolute it constituted its own kind of intelligence, a tactical mind that processed threat and response with a speed that still surprised people who had served beside him for years, and a loyalty to the warriors under his command that was, in the particular context of the Adeptus Astartes, almost radical in its completeness. He cared about his men. This sounds unremarkable. In practice, in an institution that demands the transcendence of individual attachment in service of collective purpose, it was not unremarkable at all. It was specific and demanding, and sometimes, in the cold arithmetic of command, costly. He cared about his men in the way that expressed itself not through warmth. There was no warmth precisely, not the kind that uses that word, but through attention. He knew their tendencies. He knew which of his sergeants needed to be given the objective and left alone, and which needed the objective and a framework, and which needed the objective and a reason. He knew who was carrying a wound they hadn't reported and who was carrying one they had. He knew the difference between a warrior going quiet from focus and a warrior going quiet from something that needed to be addressed. He knew Titus. He knew him the way that certain commanders know their finest instruments, not through explicit conversation, not through the kind of expressed understanding that requires language, but through the accumulated observation of decades. He knew that Titus would find the flaw in a plan before anyone else in the room identified it, and that he would name it without political calculation, and that the naming would be correct. He knew that Titus fought from the front, not from recklessness, but from the genuine conviction that a commander who understood the enemy only through data reports was working with inferior intelligence. He knew that Titus had never, in 50 years of service, asked for recognition of any kind, and that this absence was not humility performed, but humility constitutive, built in, bone deep. He had made Titus the sergeant of his command squad because he trusted him with his life, in the most literal sense the role implied, and because in the more complicated sense, he trusted him with the decisions that would survive him. He had never told Titus this directly. In the Ultramarines, you didn't. The Codex did not have a chapter on the specific language of care between a captain and his finest sergeant. The relationship was expressed through the assignments given, the authority delegated, the moments when Trajan stepped back and let Titus lead, and both of them understood what the stepping back meant without either of them needing to say it. Titus had never told Trajan what he meant to him either. He would spend a long time, later, in a room with no windows, and nothing to do but think, sitting with the particular weight of that unsaid thing. Not guilt, exactly. There had been no failure of understanding between them, no missed opportunity for something that would have changed the relationship. The relationship had been what it was, and what it was had been real and sufficient, and they had both known it. But the words had never been spoken, and once Trajan was dead, the moment for speaking them was also dead. And in the particular silence of a century-long imprisonment, with every other anchor to the life before gone or going, the unsaid things acquire a weight disproportionate to their volume. This is what the access tunnels take. This is what the surgeries could not have anticipated removing. The capacity to grieve the unsaid things in real time, while there is still the possibility of saying them. The apothecarium rebuilt him to complete objectives. It did not rebuild him to sit with a captain before a campaign and say, "You matter to me. You have made me what I am. I want you to know that I see what you have given." In the Ultramarines you didn't. You served, and service was its own declaration. On Beta Arcturus, they served together for the last time. The Bealtan war host had arrived without the courtesy of a warning that left time for adequate preparation. This was characteristic of the Eldar, or the Eldari, as certain scholars of Xenos culture had begun insisting they be called, a terminological precision that had not yet penetrated the working vocabulary of most Space Marine captains operating in the field. They moved at a speed that conventional Imperial tactical doctrine consistently underestimated, struck with a precision that required either intelligence gathered over a very long period or a form of battlefield awareness that human cognition could not fully map, and departed when their objective was achieved with the same efficiency, leaving behind only destruction calibrated to purpose. They had not come to hold Beta Arcturus. They had come for something specific, something in the planetary governor's archive, something that the governor himself would later claim ignorance of, and whose nature was never formally established in any record accessible to the Second Company. They had given the Imperial governor a withdrawal ultimatum. The governor, calculating incorrectly, had not withdrawn. The Bealtan Autarch had taken this as the answer it was, and launched the ground assault. By the time the righteous fury entered orbit, and Trajan reviewed the tactical picture from the strategium, the planet's cities were burning. His response was immediate and characteristic. No extended planning cycle, no request for reinforcement, no systematic assessment of the full enemy disposition. He identified the command structure. The Autarch, directing from a mobile command platform in the capital's central district, and he went directly at it. Half a company in drop pods and thunderhawks, punching through the Eldar's air defense with the specific brutality of a force that accepts casualties in exchange for speed, aimed like a spear at the enemy's center of gravity. It was exactly the kind of precision strike the Ultramarines were known for. It was also, Titus would later understand, exactly the kind of move the Eldar had anticipated. Not because Trajan was predictable. He wasn't, not exactly. But because the Ultramarines' doctrine was precise enough that a sufficiently sophisticated opponent could model it. And the Eldar were, by any measure that mattered, sufficiently sophisticated. The Autarch died in single combat with Trajan. This was real. No ambiguity, no manipulation in that exchange. Trajan fought her and killed her, and the kill was honest. She was a war leader of extraordinary capability, and he met her at the height of her ability, and won. And the cost was most of the blood in his body, and every reserve of whatever resource it is, that Space Marines draw on in the final moments of a duel they are not certain of winning. Titus was fighting her bodyguard while this happened. The Autarch's personal guard were aspect warriors, specialists, each one of them the product of decades of absolute dedication to a single perfected form of combat. Striking scorpions, fast, silent, armored in the particular jade green of their shrine, masters of the ambush and the kill that comes before the target has processed that they are in danger. They were not expecting the sergeant of the Ultramarine command squad to match their speed with 50 years of accumulated close-quarters experience, or to read the patterns of their movement, the precise way a striking scorpion commits to a kill stroke, the quarter-second of recovery that follows, the specific angle at which the mandiblasters discharge. With the fluency of a man who had spent decades choosing to understand his enemies by fighting them at point-blank range rather than through data reports. He killed 3 of them. The other 2 withdrew with the autarch's body when Trajan's squad recovered her after the duel. They withdrew efficiently, cleanly, with the particular discipline of warriors executing a planned retreat rather than fleeing a defeat. They took something with them when they withdrew. They took Leandros. I want to stop here and give you a proper introduction to the man, because the story he will come to occupy in the narrative ahead is too significant to let him arrive as an afterthought. Battle brother Leandros. Young, in the relative terms available when discussing space marines, where youth is measured in decades rather than years. Competent, physically capable in the ways that the selection trials and the apothecarium's process guarantees in all who survive them. No disciplinary history, no noted failings. A service record that read, to a casual reviewer, as unremarkable in its correctness. Which is to say, he did what was required, consistently, at standard or above, without deviation. He studied doctrine. This is the detail that would later acquire its full weight, but it is worth planting here. Leandros studied the codex astartes with a thoroughness that went beyond preparation. He did not study it to understand, or rather, understanding was not the end point. He studied it to authorize. The codex to Leandros was the terminal reference. When it spoke, the question of what should be done was answered. When it was silent, a gap existed that required filling by the nearest applicable principle. When it was clear, there was no further discussion to be had. This relationship to doctrine is common in the Adeptus Astartes. It is, in many ways, the intended relationship. The codex as operating system, the warrior as the hardware running it. Disagreement with the codex, deviation from its principles, the insertion of personal judgment in the space where doctrine was clear. These are the pathways by which good warriors become dangerous ones. The codex exists precisely to remove the variability of individual human judgment from the tactical equation. Titus operated differently. Titus had always operated differently, not in defiance of the codex, but in addition to it. He treated doctrine as the framework and experience as the refinement, the accumulated specificity of actual combat filling in the spaces that general principles could not fully address. He would rather face a carnifex in close combat to learn how it moved than rely on a data report compiled by someone who had not. He read the codex and then he read the battlefield, and he held both in his mind simultaneously, and he made decisions from the intersection. Leandros observed this. He had been observing it since his assignment to the second company. He watched his captain's methods with the particular attention of a man cataloging a discrepancy, not to understand it, not to learn from it, but to document it. The expression on his face during these observations was one that Titus read as admiration. He was wrong about what he was reading. But that revelation belongs to a later chapter. On Beta Arcturus, Leandros was young and newly blooded, and had made a tactical error during the bodyguard engagement. A brief moment of exposure, a half-second where his attention was fractured between 2 targets, that the striking scorpions exploited with ruthless efficiency. They had him before he had finished processing what was happening. Trajan faced his decision while he was still bleeding from the duel. The tactical calculus was not obscure. They had achieved the objective. The autarch was dead. The Eldar were withdrawing. The ground war was, in practical terms, concluding. The rational response, the response that minimized further ultramarine casualties and maximized mission efficiency, was to allow the withdrawal to complete and accept the loss of one battle brother as the cost of an otherwise successful engagement. This was also unambiguously a violation of what Trajan believed. He had not commanded the Second Company for decades by making the purely rational calculation when it conflicted with the human one. He was not built, or rather, he had not built himself, to leave a brother in enemy hands when there was still the possibility of getting him back. The codex demanded it. His own values demanded it. He was going after Leandros, and the only question was how. He told Titus to hold the position and secure the battlefield. He took a combat squad, and he went in after the Eldar. The narrator notes, plainly because plainness is the only register adequate to this moment, that Trajan was a brilliant commander who was, in the specific circumstances of Beta Arcturus, in the hour after a duel that should have killed him, fighting at well below the capacity that had made him brilliant. He was blood-depleted, post-adrenal, operating on the particular fuel of a Space Marine's engineered resilience, rather than anything that could be called optimal function. He knew this. He went anyway. The Eldar had left Leandros as bait. This was not improvisation. The captive was a preset element of a preset trap, a killing ground with concealed positions and pre-planned fields of fire, designed not for the initial engagement, but for the recovery attempt. The autarch had anticipated the Ultramarines' values. She had anticipated that they would not leave a brother behind. She had anticipated that the commander who came for him would be the commander whose loss would do the most damage. She died in the duel. Her trap survived her. Trajan and his combat squad were surrounded within 4 minutes of entry. They died in 8. Titus heard it in the same way he had heard the first ambush, in the gap between the Vox burst and the moment his body began moving. But this time, what he heard underneath the tactical information was different. This time it was not a quality leaving him. This time, it was something colder and more specific. He heard the silence where Trajan's Vox signal had been, and then he was moving, and the part of him that needed to process what that silence meant was set aside, filed, deferred, placed in a category of things that would be addressed when there was time to address them. And the part of him that had been trained for exactly this situation, the part that the apothecarium and the scout years and 5 decades of service had built for exactly this moment, came fully online. He assumed command. He did not hesitate, did not convene, did not request authorization from a chain of command that had just lost its head. He assessed the tactical situation in the time it took him to reach the nearest squad position, and he made decisions, and he transmitted them, and the company moved. What followed was a masterclass in exactly the kind of warfare the Second Company was built for. He read the Elders' movements the way he had learned to read every enemy, by watching them, by being present in the engagement rather than removed from it, by making the inference from observed behavior rather than from doctrine, applied retrospectively. He identified their withdrawal vectors and cut them off. He divided his forces in a way that looked, from inside the Elder position, like more ultramarines than were actually present. He turned the trap inside out. The force that had come to exploit an ambush found itself contained, its escape routes closed, its tactical advantage neutralized by a response faster than it had been designed to accommodate. He did this while processing, in whatever compartment a Space Marine sets aside for the things that cannot be addressed mid-engagement, the fact that Trajan was dead. He recovered his captain's body from the killing ground. He recovered Leandros, alive, shaken, making no sound that anyone noted. He drove the remaining Eldar off the planet with the specific completeness of a man who has decided that the job will be finished and the question of cost will be addressed afterward. He bore Trajan home to Macraga. He stood in the strategium of the righteous fury during the transit, and he planned the after-action report, and he reviewed the casualties, and he determined what needed to be filed and what needed to be addressed before the vessel reached Ultramar. He did not grieve. He could not grieve, not then, not in any way visible to anyone around him. The apothecarium had not left him without feeling. What it had taken was not the feeling, but the permission to stop. The operational pause that grief requires was not available, so it went somewhere. It went into the report. It went into the precision of the transit planning. It went, most visibly, into the single additional line he added to the after-action summary, in a notation so dry it almost concealed its weight. Captain Trajan's decision to pursue recovery of captured battle brother was consistent with codex principles and chapter values. His conduct in all respects was exemplary. He did not write what Trajan had meant to him. He wrote what Trajan had been. In the Ultramarines, you didn't. Calgar reviewed the Beta Arcturus campaign in his private strategium for 3 days before summoning Titus. The review was thorough in the way that Marneus Calgar's strategic assessments were always thorough. Exhaustive, systematic, free from the kind of loyalty bias that would have led a lesser commander to soften what the record showed. He looked at every decision made, every order transmitted, every casualty sustained, and every objective achieved. He looked at the counterattack. He looked at the recovery of Trajan's body and of the captured battle brother. He looked at the final engagement and the completeness of the Eldar withdrawal. He summoned Titus, and he made the field command permanent. There was ceremony, because the Ultramarines maintained ceremony. There was the formal investiture, the transfer of the company's banner, the acknowledgement by First Captain Agamemnon and the assembled senior officers. There was a moment when Calgar looked at him, the particular look of a chapter master assessing not the warrior in front of him, but the institution the warrior represents, and said, in the plain language that Calgar reserved for plain truths, "You performed as the codex demands, and as this chapter requires. The second company is yours." It was the highest thing Calgar knew how to give. Titus received it the way he received everything. He filed it. He began planning. And in the years that followed, 10 years of campaign after campaign, victory after victory, the second company under his command, establishing a record that the chapter historians noted, with a specific combination of pride and the particular reserve, that the Ultramarines applied to anything that might, in the wrong register, be called individual glory. He built something, not a legacy. He did not think in terms of legacy, not a reputation. He did not collect reputation the way other commanders did not trade in it, did not maintain it as a separate enterprise alongside the work itself. What he built was a company. He built it the way Trajan had taught him, through attention, through the specific knowledge of each warrior's tendencies and capacities, through the willingness to be present in the engagement rather than behind it. He led from the front not because the codex required it in every circumstance, but because he had decided, from direct experience, that it produced better outcomes and better warriors. A company that saw its captain fight fought differently than a company that received its captain's orders from the strategium. 10 years, one victory after another. Somewhere in the second year, Leandros was assigned permanently to the second company. He was not the same warrior who had been pulled from the Eldar's killing ground on Beta Arcturus. Something in those few hours, the capture, the waiting, the transit back, had settled in him in a particular way. Not trauma, exactly. Not damage. In any categorization the apothecarian would have formally recognized. Something more deliberate. A decision arrived at in the specific conditions of helplessness that had crystallized into a perspective he would carry forward without revision. He served well. He met his assignments with precision and his engagement protocols without deviation. He was, in every measurable sense, a fine space marine. He studied the codex, and he watched Titus. In the early months, Titus read this watching as the natural attention of a younger warrior, calibrating himself to a new command environment, learning how the captain operated, what was expected, how the company functioned. This was normal. This was healthy. This was how warriors became better warriors. As the months became years, the watching acquired a quality that Titus noticed, but could not fully name. It was not the watching of learning. It had a different quality to it, the quality of observation conducted with a prior conclusion, of a man who is not discovering but confirming. Leandros watched Titus lead from the front and noted it. Watched Titus choose direct engagement over theoretical planning and noted it. Watched the moments when Titus's response to a situation came from instinct refined by experience rather than doctrine applied by rote, and noted those moments with an attention that was altogether too precise for admiration. Titus, who had been taught to trust the system and the men it produced, decided it was admiration. He was not naive, he was principled. The distinction matters enormously, and it is the distinction that the story will keep pressing on, because the tragedy does not come from Titus being foolish. It comes from Titus being exactly what he was supposed to be, in a situation that required him to be something else, something that the Imperium had not built into him and would not have sanctioned if it had tried. He trusted Leandros, because Leandros was a battle brother of the Ultramarines, because the institution that had made them both was the institution whose judgment Titus had lived inside for his entire adult existence, because to distrust a brother without evidence was to violate something deeper than tactical protocol. It was to violate the premise on which everything was built. He trusted the system to have produced what it claimed to produce. The system had produced Leandros precisely as intended. The orders for Greya arrived on a morning unremarkable in every respect. Titus was in the tactical planning bay of the Righteous Fury, working through a movement problem his second squad had encountered during the last Void exercise, when the Vox officer brought the deployment orders and left them on the edge of the hololith table without interrupting. This was a courtesy the company's staff had learned, that the captain worked through problems to their conclusion before receiving new information, and that interrupting the middle of his thinking produced worse outcomes than waiting 2 minutes for its end. He finished the movement problem. He picked up the orders. Greya, Forge World, Orc Invasion, War Grimschool, significant mass, approaching saturation of planetary defense capacity. Primary objective, secure the Titan manufactorum and prevent seizure of war engines. Secondary, coordinate with surviving Imperial Guard contingent, designation Cadian 81st, Lieutenant Mira commanding. He read the orders twice, annotated the tactical maps with the particular shorthand his company recognized as the precursor to a detailed brief, sent for his senior sergeants, began planning the approach. Somewhere in the process, in the review of the Greya atmospheric data, or the assessment of the manufactorum's structural layout, or the calculation of drop pod insertion vectors, given the anti-aircraft density the intelligence reports suggested. He noted the name on the senior sergeant's roster assigned to accompany him. Leandros. He noted it and moved on. He was magnificent at his work. He had always been magnificent at his work. And somewhere, in a communications terminal on a different deck, in the privacy of an alcove between shift changes, at a time that would later be established as approximately 18 standard hours before the righteous fury achieved Greya orbit. A message was composed and transmitted to an address in the Inquisitorial administrative network, not to Thrax, not yet. The network does not work that way. The message went to the address. The address passed it to an analyst. The analyst flagged it for escalation. The escalation reached a desk in the ordo malleus that was already holding a file. A file opened decades before, containing a single line about a sergeant in the second company who was exceptional and recommended for monitoring. The file was no longer dormant. Titus did not know the file existed. He had never known the file existed. He stepped off the boarding ramp onto Greya's ash-choked surface and felt the particular quality of the air, heavy, industrial, laced with promethium particulate, and the distant organic wrongness of an orc war host at full mobilization. And he oriented himself to the ground and began the work. He did not know the message had been sent. He would not know for another 6 days. Those 6 days were the last 6 days of everything he had built, and Leandros spent each of them at his captain's side, fighting with precision, obeying every order, meeting every engagement with the correctness that had always distinguished him, and waiting with the patience of a man who has already made his decision and requires only the right event to attach it to, for Greya to provide the conclusion to the report he had already written. On Greya, it would. Chapter 3. The Mouth of the Trap. There is a particular quality to a trap that is well laid. It smells like opportunity. It moves like providence. Every door opens easily. Every path forward presents itself with the clarity of a thing that was always meant to be. And the man walking through it feels, in his best moments, like he is finally operating at the exact level of his ability. Like the universe is cooperating with his excellence for once. Like all the years of preparation have arrived at the engagement they were preparing for. That feeling is the trap. Titus landed on Greya and breathed its air, and felt the particular focus that descended on him at the beginning of a difficult campaign. The narrowing of attention, the calibration of every system to the work ahead. And he did not know he was already inside it. He had been inside it, in the most precise sense, since before the righteous fury achieved orbit, since before the orders arrived, since before a file in an Inquisitorial administrative network had been reopened by a message transmitted from a terminal on his own ship. He did not know any of this. He knew the smell of Greya, ash, primary and pervasive, the product of a world that had been burning promethium and exhausting industrial waste into its atmosphere for 3,000 years of uninterrupted mechanicus operation. Coolant fluid, sweet and slightly nauseating beneath the ash smell, leaking from the damaged macro pipes that ran along the manufacturum district's outer walls. Burning, not industrial burning, but the different and specific burning of a war zone, where what is on fire is not fuel, but everything, structures and vehicles, and the particular smell that Titus had catalogued over 50 years of campaigns, and could not, despite the cataloguing, entirely normalize. And beneath all of it, beneath the ash and the coolant and the burning, something else. Something that did not have a name in the olfactory register of even a space marine's enhanced senses. Not a chemical compound, not a biological marker. Something that the warp leaves behind when it has been present. When something that does not belong in physical space has been here long enough to leave an imprint. The smell of a place that has already been decided. Titus registered it, filed it, moved on. He had always been exceptional at moving on. The man who introduced himself as Inquisitor Drogon of the Ordo Xenos met them at the primary manufactorum gate at the edge of the contested district, accompanied by a retinue of 6, 4 combat-rated acolytes in carapace armor, and 2 figures in the hooded grey of inquisitorial analysts, carrying data slates and saying nothing. He was a man of middle years, or appeared to be. In the Inquisition, apparent age was a poor guide to actual age, and certain members of the Ordo had access to juvenate treatments that complicated the reading considerably. He had the specific physical quality of a man who had spent decades in difficult environments, lean, conserving, with the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from the management of a body that has learned to spend energy only when spending it is necessary. His eyes were the particular color of old brass, and they moved with an assessor's precision, cataloguing the second company's disembarkation with the practiced efficiency of someone who had received briefings on the unit and was now checking the briefing against the reality. He briefed Titus on the tactical situation in precise, well-organized summary. The Orc invasion, its composition, its current disposition, its rate of advance, the points at which the planetary defense forces had collapsed, and the points where they were holding. Lieutenant Mira's Cadian contingent, their position, their supply status, their capacity for sustained engagement, the manufactorum, its layout, its strategic value, the specific war engines currently in various stages of completion, whose capture by the Orcs would represent a materially significant shift in the balance of the campaign. He was, as a briefer, excellent, organized, specific. He anticipated the questions Titus would ask and answered them before they were fully formed. He had clearly spent significant time in the Manufactorum district before the invasion, understood its geometry in a way that required presence rather than data review, and was able to overlay tactical recommendation onto structural knowledge with a fluency that Titus recognized as the product of genuine field experience. There was something wrong with him. Titus registered it in the way he registered most things that required closer examination, as a filed notation, set aside for processing when bandwidth permitted, not dismissed, but not yet acted on. The wrongness was not large. It did not announce itself. It was present in the very small margins of the man's behavior, the places where the performance of being Inquisitor Drogon required a fraction more effort than it should have. A half-beat of delay occasionally, between a question and a response, as though the answer was being retrieved rather than recalled. A quality of the eyes, sometimes, when he thought he was not being watched. A flatness that did not belong to exhaustion, or to the particular affect suppression of a man who had learned to manage his responses in difficult environments, but to something else, something that Titus could identify as absence, without being able to identify what was absent. He filed it. The tactical situation was urgent. The Orc advance was real. Lieutenant Mira's position was deteriorating. He moved on. This is the mechanism of manipulation that is most difficult to defend against, even for the excellent and the experienced. The manipulation that does not require the target to be foolish. Titus was not fooled because he missed the signs. He was fooled because the signs were real and insufficient, and the tactical situation was urgent, and he had been built, in every way that mattered, to prioritize the mission over the unverifiable suspicion. The Inquisitor's briefing was accurate. His tactical recommendations were sound. The intel he provided produced results. Every door opened easily. Titus moved through them. What he could not see, what the narrator can now show you, from the distance of retrospect, was this. The real Inquisitor Drogon had been dead for 4 months. He had died in the sub-levels of the Manufactorum district, alone, investigating a power source that the deceased Mechanicus adepts had been cataloguing before the Orc invasion made such cataloguing academic. He had died badly and quickly, and in the moment of his death something had moved into the space his body occupied, and begun the specific process of wearing it. Demons. True demons. Warp entities of sufficient coherence and intelligence to maintain a physical anchor in real space. are not common. The conditions required for their manifestation are specific and unstable, but certain entities, patient ones that have existed in the Imperium long enough to develop the particular kind of cunning that only vast spans of time can produce, learn to use the deaths of individuals as doorways. The moment of death creates a threshold, a sufficiently prepared entity waiting in the warp for exactly such a threshold can step through. What wore Drogon's face had been waiting. It had helped create the conditions for the waiting, had seeded the chaos energy source that Drogon had been investigating, had arranged the specific sequence of events that brought him to the sub-levels alone, had prepared the threshold with the precision of something that had done this before, and understood the engineering of it. It had been guiding the Greya campaign from inside the identity of an Inquisitor for 4 months before Titus landed. Everything Titus achieved on Greya, every Orc position cleared, every advance made, every tactical problem solved with the excellence that was simply his natural operating mode, was a step in someone else's plan. The Orc invasion was real. The threat to the Titan manufactorum was real. Titus was genuinely saving Greya from a greenskin force that would have stripped it to the bones. But saving Greya was not what the thing wearing Drogon's face required. What it required was a specific individual, with a specific capability, at a specific location, at a specific time. It required Titus at the orbital spire, and Titus, brilliant, experienced, incorruptible Titus, was walking toward it with every step of the campaign, guided by excellent tactical intelligence, moving through doors that opened easily, feeling the focus of a man operating exactly at the level of his ability. Before the spire, before Nimmeroth, before the thing in the air above Greya that would change everything and nothing simultaneously. Before all of that, there was a conversation that Titus did not know would be the last of its kind. Veteran Sergeant Sidonis found him between engagements, in the brief operational pause, while the company consolidated a cleared manufactorum block, and the scouts advanced to assess the next Orc position. The pause lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Sidonis used 6 of them. He had served in the second company for 30 years, 11 of them under Titus, and he had arrived at the particular relationship with his captain that very few warriors achieved. Not friendship exactly, because the Ultramarines did not have a precise category for what this was, but something that functioned like friendship in all the ways that mattered. He could say things that no one else in the company could say, not because Titus granted him special license, but because Sidonis had spent 11 years demonstrating that the things he said were worth hearing, and Titus had spent 11 years learning to recognize the specific quality of Sidonis's attention as a reliable signal. When Sidonis paid attention to something, it warranted attention. He sat beside Titus on the edge of a collapsed machinery housing and looked out at the cleared block for a moment, and then he said without preamble, "The Inquisitor." Titus waited. "Something's wrong with him." "Noted," Titus said. Sidonis looked at him. "You've seen it. Something. Not enough to act on." "I've been trying to identify it for 3 days." Sidonis was quiet for a moment. "It's not him. I don't mean behaviorally. I mean, it's not him. I've worked alongside Ordo Xenos operatives before. They carry something. Some of them carry it like a burden, some like a weapon, some like they've forgotten it's there. It's the mark of what they've seen, what they've done. It's specific to each person. You can't counterfeit it because you'd need to know exactly what kind of weight they're carrying. Drogon doesn't carry anything. He paused, finding the word. Empty. Titus sat with this. "After the spire," he said finally. "We address it after the spire." Sidonis nodded. He did not argue. This was the other thing about him. He understood the architecture of priority. He had said what needed saying. Titus had received it. The decision about when to act on it was the captain's decision, and he trusted the captain's judgment. And the tactical situation was urgent. After the spire, Sidonis agreed. He died 6 hours later. The chaos forces they encountered in the approach to the orbital spire were a warband of Nimroth's renegades. Marines, malevolent turned or perhaps never entirely loyal. Decades of service abandoned for the specific corruption that the warp offers to men who are strong enough to want more than service and weak enough to accept the price. They came out of a collapsed transit corridor without warning, and the engagement was close and immediate and brutal in the way that engagements between space marines always are. Every combatant too capable, too fast, too resilient for the fight to have the ordinary rhythm of a battle. It was physics applied to armored giants, violence at a level of intensity that made the orc engagements of the previous days look manageable by comparison. Sidonis died protecting Titus from a strike he did not see coming. That is the clean version. The specific version is that a Chaos Marine with a powered maul came through a gap in the formation at an angle that put Titus in direct line, and Sidonis stepped into the gap and the maul connected, and the damage was sufficient that nothing the Apothecarium could have done in time would have changed the outcome. It was fast. It was without drama. It was the kind of death that combat produces when two forces of equivalent capability meet in a confined space. Not heroic, not narrative, just the brutal probability distribution of a close engagement expressing itself. Titus did not stop. He could not stop. He had been built not to stop. He killed the Chaos Marine. He killed the one beside it. He assessed the formation, redistributed, and continued the advance toward the spire. In the silence left by Sidonis, the specific silence of a position in the formation that had always been occupied and was now not, there was no longer anyone in the company who would tell Titus what Leandros was doing. That silence would outlast the campaign. It would outlast the planet. It would be, in the fullness of what followed, one of the most consequential silences in the history of the Second Company. The orbital spire of Greya rose through the ash atmosphere like a piece of the void-made material, a needle of augmetic steel and mechanicus devotion, kilometers tall, its upper reaches lost in the smog layer that perpetually covered the planet's industrial zone. It had been built to anchor the great void shields that protected the Manufactorum district from orbital bombardment. It housed communications relays and atmospheric processors, and the particular kind of mechanicus infrastructure that requires vertical distance from the planet's surface to function. It was, in its way, magnificent. Something had been done to it. Titus felt it in the same register that he had felt the smell of Greya, below the threshold of specific identification, present as wrongness rather than data. The spire's upper levels pulsed with something that was not electrical, and was not mechanical, and was not any frequency in the spectrum of energies that the physical world is supposed to contain. The air around it was wrong. Not dirty, wrong. The particular wrongness of a space where the boundary between real space and the immaterium has been deliberately thinned, where something with sufficient power and sufficient intent has been pushing at the membrane of reality from the other side for long enough to leave bruises. Chaos. Lord Nimroth was at the summit. He had been a space marine once. This is the detail that the Chaos Warband records note with the specific absence of reflection that characterizes their documentation of their own histories. A space marine of a chapter whose identity the records are deliberately unclear about. In the period of their service before the turning, he had been capable. He had been strong. He had wanted, in the specific way that strength combined with ambition produces wanting more than service could offer. The warp had offered it to him. He had accepted. He was in the process of accepting something more. Demonhood is not a gift. This needs to be said clearly, because the vocabulary of chaos, the elevation, the ascension, the transformation, carries implications of improvement that are precisely wrong. Demonhood is the point at which a mortal vessel becomes entirely expendable to the entity that has been inhabiting it. The flesh is reshaped. The mind is reduced to a function. What remains is not the warrior who made the bargain. That person, whatever they were and whatever they chose, is gone. What remains is a thing that wears the architecture of that person's ambition as a frame for something else entirely. Nimmiroth was in transition. The process was partially complete. His armor had not been discarded. It had been incorporated, the ceramite fusing with tissue in ways that violated the categories of either material. The joints of it gone, replaced by continuous surfaces that moved with a liquidity that armor should not have. His face was present and not present. The features his warband would have recognized beneath the helmet were visible in the structure of what his head was becoming. But they were scaffolding now, the underlying geometry of a form that was being rebuilt around them. The eyes were wrong. They had been wrong for some time, in the way that the eyes of the possessed are always wrong. Something looking through them that was not the person who owned the face. He was bathed in warp energy, the real, concentrated, direct presence of it, not the background radiation of a warp-touched battlefield, not the residual contamination of a site where chaos had operated, but the primary source. Raw chaos energy, the pure currency of the Imperium, flowing through his body as fuel for the transformation. Titus saw it. Titus advanced into it. He felt it when it touched him. This needs to be described, because it is the moment the entire story pivots on, the moment that the narrator has been circling since the very first line of Chapter 1. The warp, in concentrated exposure, does specific things to mortal flesh. It does not merely corrupt. Corruption is the word used by those who have not experienced it, a word that implies a gradual process, a slow degradation. What the warp does at close range is more immediate and more total than corruption. It reaches into the specific frequencies at which a mortal mind operates, and it begins to rewrite them. It finds the thing that the mind is, the particular configuration of memory and belief and identity that constitutes a person, and it applies pressure to it, the way water applies pressure to a stone, gradually, constantly, from every direction, simultaneously. To a baseline human, this pressure produces madness within seconds. Seconds. To a space marine, enhanced, fortified, psychically conditioned in ways that ordinary humans are not. It produces sustained agony and, usually, one of two outcomes. Death from system failure as the body's own processes turn against the organism, or corruption so thorough that what remains is no longer recognizable as either the person or the chapter that produced them. Usually. Titus felt it hit him. He felt the pressure, the specific sensation of something vast and alien and utterly indifferent pushing at the edges of what he was. He felt it reach into the frequencies at which his mind operated, and he felt it begin to apply pressure. He felt the hunger in it, the specific quality of the warp's attention when it has found something it intends to consume, and then something that was already inside him, something he had no name for, something that the apothecarium had not installed and the hypno-conditioning had not placed there, something that might have been there since Tarantis, or might have been there since before Tarantis, since before the body the apothecarium had rebuilt had been born at all. That thing pushed back. Not with effort, not with will, not with resistance, not with the heroic refusal of a man fighting the darkness, with something quieter and more absolute, with a simple, constitutional, structural no. The warp pressed. The thing inside him said no. The warp pressed harder. The thing inside him said no again, in the same quiet register, without escalating, without drama. He fought Nimmiroth in this condition. He grabbed a being that was partially a Chaos Lord, and partially something that had ceased to be human in any sense, and partially a conduit for warp energy that should have been fatal to touch, and he held on, and they went over the edge of the spire together. The fall through the corrupted sky above Greya lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds of free fall through air that was not entirely air anymore, through the zone of warped reality that surrounded the spire like a wound in the world. 11 seconds of direct, unmediated contact with the energies that were remaking Nimmiroth, pouring through both of them, the transformation process accelerating and then catastrophically destabilizing as Titus struck and kept striking. Not with weapons, because in the fall there were no weapons, only bodies and will, struck at the architecture of what Nimmiroth was becoming, at the specific junctions of the transformation, and the thing inside him that said no kept saying it, quietly, constitutionally, without drama. Nimmiroth came apart, not physically, not in the way a body comes apart, in the way a process comes apart when its operating conditions are disrupted past the tolerance of the system running it. The transformation unraveled, the warp energy destabilized, and found the unstable power source that had been fueling it, and the detonation closed the tear in the sky above Greya with a concussive force that felt, to the survivors on the ground, like a second gravity event. Titus hit the ash of Greya's surface and did not die. He lay in the ash for several seconds. The sky above him was wrong still. It would be wrong for years, the scar of a closed warp tear taking time to heal, that the Mechanicus could not accelerate. But the pulsing wrongness of an open tear was gone. The pressure was gone. The specific hunger of the warp's attention, which had been pressing at him from the moment he entered the spire's influence and had intensified through every second of the fall, was gone. He was intact, uncorrupted as far as any immediate self-assessment could determine. His armor had sustained significant damage. 3 ribs were broken. His left arm had damage at the elbow joint that the internal systems flagged as requiring apothecarium attention within the next 48 hours. He stood up. He looked at the sky. He did not know why he had survived. He could feel the shape of the not knowing, the specific absence of explanation in the place where an explanation should have been. He had felt the warp press at him and had felt the thing inside him push back. And he had no classification for the thing that had pushed back, no chapter doctrine that addressed it, no precedent in his own experience or in any record he had accessed. He stood in the ash of a saved forge world, and he did not know what he was. He began walking back toward the company position. He had a report to file. He had casualties to account for. He had an after-action assessment to prepare and a Vox message to send to the Righteous Fury, confirming mission completion. He did not feel the change. He did not know it was visible. He did not know that the specific quality of his survival, the intactness of him, the absence of any mark the warp had left, was, to a certain kind of observer, more alarming than corruption would have been. Corruption could be understood. Corruption was classified, documented, treated according to protocol. A man who emerged from direct warp exposure, uncorrupted, was a man who had done something the classification system had no entry for. And Leandros, who had observed the fall from a position on the spire's lower level, who had seen the warp energy and watched his captain descend through it and land in the ash and stand up unchanged, was already composing, in the precise inner architecture of a mind that had been waiting for this specific event since before the campaign began, the language of his report. The HAB unit Leandros used was undamaged. This was not coincidence. He had identified it during the campaign's second day as a structurally sound location in the cleared zone, away from the company's main position, far enough that the composition of a private transmission would not be observed or overheard. He sat at the communications terminal. He opened the report document he had begun drafting 11 days before, not on Greya, but in transit, in the privacy of his bunk aboard the Righteous Fury, in the hours after the deployment orders arrived, and before anyone else in the company was awake. He did not look uncertain. He did not look conflicted. He had the expression of a man completing a task that has a correct answer and is arriving at it. He wrote in the precise, formal register of inquisitorial documentation the specific vocabulary of a report intended not for a human reader's comprehension, but for a system's processing, designed to be clear, unambiguous, and above all, actionable. The report cited, in order, the observed tactical irregularities during the Greya campaign, specifically the captain's pattern of direct engagement over doctrinal protocol. It cited the confirmed warp energy exposure during the orbital spire engagement. It cited the observed outcome of that exposure: survival, apparent uncorruption, no visible physical or psychological degradation. It cited the relevant sections of the codex astartes pertaining to unexplained phenomena in the field. It cited the relevant sections of Inquisitorial cross-agency protocol pertaining to space marine conduct, warranting ordo malleus review. Every citation was accurate. Every observation was factually correct. There was not a single false statement in the document. The report concluded with a formal recommendation for inquisitorial investigation and temporary detention of the subject pending assessment. The subject was named. Leandros read the report once, beginning to end, with the careful attention of a man who understands that what he is transmitting cannot be recalled. He found it satisfactory. He transmitted it. He closed the terminal. He sat for a moment in the silence of the undamaged HAB unit, with the ash smell of Greya coming through the filtered air system, and he felt the specific quality of a man who has acted in accordance with his deepest convictions. Then he went to find his captain. Titus was standing at the edge of the cleared zone, looking at the spire, looking at the scar in the sky above it, processing in the particular way he processed things, quietly, completely, without visible exterior evidence of the interior work. Leandros approached and rendered the post-engagement report. Casualties: 8 dead, including Sidonis, the name delivered in the same register as the others, without additional weight. Structural damage to the Manufactorum district, estimated at 31%. Lieutenant Mira's contingent status: combat effective, reduced capacity. Estimated recovery timeline for resumption of full Manufactorum operations: 2 years, Mechanicus assessment pending. Titus listened. He nodded at the appropriate intervals. He asked 2 clarifying questions about the casualty processing and one about Mira's supply situation. He was already, clearly, planning the next phase: the consolidation, the handover to the planetary defense forces, the transit back to Macraga. Leandros stood at parade rest and delivered his report and looked at his captain with the expression that Titus had always read as attention, or competence, or something adjacent to admiration. The report had reached its destination 3 minutes after transmission. The analyst on duty had opened it and flagged it for immediate escalation. The escalation had reached a specific desk in the Ordo Malleus administrative network, where a specific inquisitor with a specific file already open was reading it. Titus did not know this. He was looking at the scar in the sky. Those 6 hours, the 6 hours between the transmission and the moment the inquisitorial ship broke Greya orbit and hailed the Righteous Fury, were the last 6 hours of everything he had built. He spent most of them doing exactly what he had always done: planning, thinking, accounting for his death, and preparing his report and being, in every way available to him, the captain the second company needed in the aftermath of a difficult campaign. Leandros spent them standing at his side. The narrator says this quietly, almost without emphasis, because it does not require emphasis. You already understand what it means. You have understood it, on some level, since Chapter 1. Since the files and the waiting, and the system that was always running. He stood at his captain's side. He carried no visible guilt, because he felt none. He had followed protocol. He had acted in accordance with doctrine. He had, by every standard he recognized as authoritative, done the right thing. The message was already at its destination. The ship was already moving. And Titus looked at the scar in the sky above Greya, and did not know that the sky above his own life had already been opened. Chapter 4. A Century of Silence. You have been waiting for this chapter. I know you have. You have been waiting for it since the first line of Chapter 1, since the empty throne and the nameplate and the question I asked you before I told you anything else. Part of you has been listening to everything that followed. The desert world, the surgeries, the campaigns, Trajan, Sidonis, the fall from the spire, with one ear always turned toward this, toward the silence after, toward the 100 years the record skips over with the bureaucratic efficiency of an institution that has decided a thing did not happen. Part of you has been hoping I would spare you. I won't, because he wasn't spared. And if you stop listening now, if you turn away from this chapter, if you decide the broad outline is sufficient and the specific weight of it is more than you want to carry, then you will have done exactly what the Imperium did. You will have looked away. You will have decided that the cost of knowing is higher than the cost of not knowing. And you will have made the same calculation that every administrator and every senior officer and every battle brother who walked past that nameplate in the corridor of the righteous fury made in the years that followed. I am asking you not to make that calculation. Stay. Inquisitor Jerome Thrax of the Ordo Malleus arrived at Greya 3 days after the spire fell. He came in a black ship, not the great vessels of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, not the cathedral-hulled transports of the Soul Binding, but the Inquisition's own variant, smaller and darker, and built not for the movement of psychers, but for the movement of problems. It broke orbit with the righteous fury, and the vox-hail it transmitted was addressed not to the ship's command, but to Titus directly, a specificity that carried its own message, if Titus had been in the position to read it clearly. He was not. He was completing the post-campaign assessment, processing casualties, preparing the handover documents for the planetary defense forces. He was doing what he always did. He was doing the work. Thrax came to the surface with 6 inquisitorial stormtroopers and 2 interrogators and a data clerk who carried a single sealed document case and said nothing for the entirety of the proceedings. He was a tall man, Thrax, not tall in the way of space marines, but tall in the way of a man who has spent decades making other people feel that the space they occupy is borrowed. His face had the quality of something that had once been mobile and had been trained into stillness. His rank was carried in the economy of his movement, rather than in anything he said. He walked through the Greya rubble with the particular ease of a man who has been the most dangerous person in every room he has entered for a very long time and has stopped needing to announce it. He found Titus at the company's field command position. He looked at him for a long moment. Titus looked back. Then Thrax said, in the conversational register of a man reciting something he has said before, "Captain Demetrian Titus of the Ultramarine 2nd Company, you are hereby detained under the authority of the Ordo Malleus, pursuant to investigation of anomalous conduct and potential warp contamination. You will accompany this retinue. You will not resist. The detention is temporary, pending the outcome of a formal assessment." Temporary. That word will stay with you, I think. Temporary. Titus stood and listened to it. And here is the thing that I need you to sit with. because it is the thing that makes everything that follows not merely tragic, but specifically, structurally unbearable. He did not reach for his weapon. He did not signal his company. He did not demand the authority under which the detention was being made, did not challenge the jurisdiction, did not invoke his rank or his chapter's standing, or the Primarch's own seal of authority that the Ultramarines carried as their institutional inheritance. He went. Not because he was naive, not because he didn't understand what was happening. He went because he had been born on a world where the system worked and raised in an institution that worked, and he had spent 150 years inside functioning systems. And the deepest thing in him, deeper than tactical instinct, deeper than the combat conditioning, deeper than 50 years of earned suspicion about the edges of things, the deepest thing in him believed that legitimate authority, followed through legitimate channels, would produce a legitimate outcome. He believed the system. He went. Lieutenant Mira watched from a distance. The Cadian commander who had fought beside the Second Company for 6 days and owed the survival of her unit to the decisions of the man she was watching, walked toward a black ship's boarding ramp. She filed a formal inquiry with the Inquisitorial Administrative Office 3 days later. The inquiry was acknowledged, processed, and archived. No response was transmitted. The archive entry was marked. Matter closed. No further correspondence required. The battle brothers of the Second Company watched their captain go. The narrator notes this with the controlled fury it deserves. They watched. They were space marines of the Ultramarines, among the finest warriors the human species has ever produced, and they watched. Not because they were cowards, because they were the same thing Titus was, products of a system, trained to its values, built to its tolerances. And the system said, Inquisitorial authority supersedes chapter authority. The system said, resistance to legitimate detention is itself a violation. The system said, trust the process. They trusted the process. No one stopped it. Not because they couldn't, because they didn't. The erasure took 11 days. Not the physical removal that had been accomplished the moment the black ship achieved orbit. The administrative erasure, the specific and methodical process by which a person is unmade from the record of an institution, took 11 days because the Ultramarines' record-keeping was thorough, and Thrax's administrative mandate was precise, and the intersection of those two qualities produced a volume of material that required time to process. His name was removed from the chapter rolls. Not flagged, removed. There is a difference. Flagged entries remain, carry a marker, can be retrieved by someone with sufficient clearance and sufficient reason to look. Removed entries are gone. The space they occupied is overwritten. The record reads as though they were never there. Not as though they were there and something happened to them, but as though the category of their existence was never opened. His service record was reclassified to a security tier that required inquisitorial clearance to access. In practice, this meant that no ultramarine below the rank of chapter master could view it, and the chapter master's access required inquisitorial countersignature. Calgar could have requested that countersignature. There is no record of him doing so. His commendations were removed from the public archive. The campaign records he appeared in were edited, not clumsily, not in ways that left visible gaps, but with the specific expertise of an inquisitorial administrative apparatus that has been doing this for 10,000 years and is very good at it. The campaigns still happened. They simply happened without him. His position was filled. A sergeant from the 4th Company, capable, decorated, with a service record that justified the promotion, was given the captaincy of the 2nd Company within 3 weeks of the detention. He was a good officer. He served well. He had no idea whose throne he was sitting on. His bunk aboard the Righteous Fury was assigned to a newly promoted battle brother who had just completed his scout years and was still in the specific disorientation of early full deployment. A young warrior who had enough to process without asking questions about the history of the space he had been given to sleep in. He made it his own in the way that young warriors do. He put his few personal items in the storage alcoves. He learned the particular rhythm of the ship around that bunk, the vibration from the nearby engine coupling, the quality of the air recycling in that section of the barracks deck. He never knew. The bunk did not know. The corridor with the nameplate did not know, because the nameplate was removed in week 2 of the erasure, quietly, by a maintenance servitor following an automated work order that no one reviewed because no one was asked to review it. The ship continued. The chapter continued. The campaigns continued. The system, having processed a complication, returned to function. The cell was on a vessel that had no name in any registry that the Ultramarines could access. This is deliberate. The Inquisition's detention facilities, specifically those maintained by the ordo malleus for the containment of subjects who represent either confirmed or potential warp threats, are not documented in any record available to the broader Imperium. Their locations change. Their administrative designations rotate. The people who know where they are at any given time are very few, and those few are not people who speak to Space Marine chapter masters about the whereabouts of detained captains. The cell was built for what Titus was. This is important to understand. It was not a standard cell, not the kind of containment designed for baseline humans, not even the reinforced accommodation that the Inquisition maintains for the detained psychers, whose existence necessitates a higher grade of physical security. It was built for something that could not be hurt by ordinary pain, could not be weakened by ordinary deprivation, could not be destabilized by the ordinary tools of psychological pressure. It was built for a space marine. The walls were thick enough to contain a being capable of dismantling them. The door was operated by a system with no interior mechanism. The environmental controls, light, temperature, atmospheric composition, were managed externally and provided at levels sufficient for biological survival and nothing more. No windows, no clock. No means of tracking the passage of time except the intervals of the questioning sessions, which were themselves deliberately irregular, designed to prevent the development of any internal temporal framework. You cannot understand what this means unless you understand what time is to a space marine. A baseline human in a cell with no windows loses track of time within days. The circadian rhythm, tied as it is to light and activity cycles, begins to drift. Days and nights blur. The passage of time becomes approximate, then vague, then a matter of guesswork. This is disorienting. For a space marine, whose internal systems include the catalepsian node, the biological mechanism that allows half-brain sleep without loss of consciousness, whose sense of time is calibrated to the precision requirements of long-range tactical planning. The deliberate removal of temporal reference is not merely disorienting. It is a specific attack on one of the operating systems that define what he is. Thrax understood this. He had detained space marines before. Not many. This was mercifully not a common situation, but enough to understand the taxonomy of tools available. He used the only tool that works against a loyal warrior. He used it every day. Questions. The central question, stated in its simplest form, was this: why did you survive? It was not always phrased that way. Thrax was a skilled interrogator, which meant he understood that the same question asked in the same form becomes background noise. The subject habituates to it, develops a standard response, deploys the response without fully re-engaging with the question. He varied the approach. He approached it from the angle of the warp energy specifics. He approached it from the angle of the chapter's gene seed, requesting detailed accounts of the apothecarian process and any anomalies noted during implantation. He approached it from the angle of Titus's ancestry, his homeworld, the specific genetic inheritance of an agri-world population in a system within Ultramar that had, over 3,000 years of civilized development, been exposed to the particular background of an established and relatively stable sector. He approached it from theology. He approached it from biology. He approached it from the angle of the other exposures, the campaigns against chaos that Titus had participated in over his career, the moments of proximity to warp-touched phenomena that the service record documented, the cumulative exposure history of a warrior who had spent a century and a half operating in the Imperium's most contested environments. Every approach arrived at the same place, the same question, the same answer, I don't know. And every day that honest answer was recorded as suspicious. This is the mathematical elegance of the trap, the thing that makes it not merely cruel but structurally, architecturally perfect. A man who knew the answer could provide it. A man who knew the answer and refused to provide it could be pressured, or offered terms, or broken by the specific tools available to an ordo malleus inquisitor with a century to work. But a man who genuinely does not know the answer has nothing to give, and his inability to give it looks, from the outside, exactly like a man who is choosing not to give it. The truth and the lie produce the same surface. The honest response and the evasive one are identical in form. There is no version of the truth that sets him free. Year 3. He still expects to be released. Not immediately. He has processed the situation with the tactical realism that 50 years of command have made automatic, and he understands that a formal assessment takes time, that the Inquisition's administrative pace is not designed for speed, but for thoroughness. He is patient. He has always been patient. It is one of the qualities Matorus noted in the tunnel beneath Soil Processor Grid 14, the quality that made a 12-year-old boy with no fear feel like someone worth finding. He runs mental tactical exercises. He reviews engagements from his career, walks through them in detail, examines the decisions made, identifies the moments where an alternative choice would have produced a better or worse outcome. He has been doing this since his scout years. It is how he maintains his edge between deployments, how he keeps the analytical machinery operational when there is no immediate problem for it to work on. His mind is a weapon with nothing to fight. He sharpens it anyway. He waits. Year 11. He stops counting days. Not because he loses track, he loses the ability to track them accurately well before this, the irregular questioning intervals having destroyed his temporal framework within the first year. But because the counting has ceased to serve a function. He was counting toward a release that has not come. The counting was hope made numerical. He stops counting hope. He begins counting questions. The central question has been asked in its various forms 4,012 times. He knows this because counting questions is, unlike counting days, something he can do with accuracy. He has a response prepared for each variant. The responses are honest. The responses are, he has concluded, what is keeping him here. Not because they are insufficient, but because no response he can give will be sufficient, and he is only now beginning to understand the geometry of that. Year 26. The first crack, not in his loyalty, not in his sanity, not in the structural integrity of his mind, not in his identity as a warrior of the Ultramarines, or a servant of the Emperor, or any of the things that the cell was presumably designed to erode. Those hold. They hold because they are not beliefs in the ordinary sense. They are not propositions he adopted and could, under sufficient pressure, abandon. They are structural. They are what he is made of, rather than what he has decided to believe. What cracks is something different, something quieter and in its way more important. His certainty. He has spent 26 years telling Thrax and Thrax's successor that he does not know why he survived. He has meant it, every time. He has not been withholding. He has searched himself, in the way that a man with nothing but time searches himself, thoroughly, systematically, with the same methodical precision he would apply to a tactical problem. And he has found nothing, no explanation, no anomaly he can identify and name and hand over in exchange for the door opening. But in the 26th year, a new thought arrives. It arrives quietly, without drama, in the way that the thoughts which matter most tend to arrive. What if the thing I cannot find is not absent? What if it is simply not the kind of thing that can be found by looking inward? What if there is something in me that I genuinely cannot see? He sits with this for a long time. It does not comfort him. It is not meant to comfort him. It is the specific horror of 26 years, condensed into a single question he has never previously been able to formulate. Not, I don't know the answer, but I may not be the right person to look for it. Year 40. Thrax is gone. A new inquisitor takes the sessions. Her name is not given to him. He does not ask for it, because he has learned that asking for things in this place produces only the specific humiliation of the request noted and not answered. She has read the file. She resumes the questioning without greeting him, without introducing herself, without any acknowledgement of the 26 years that preceded her arrival. She does not use his name. He has a name. He knows he has a name. But she does not use it. And the file she works from does not use it. The file uses a case number, an alphanumeric designation assigned at the time of detention, and she refers to him by this designation when she refers to him at all. And in the years that follow, he will notice, he cannot help but notice, that he has begun to understand why. A name is a relationship. A name is the thing that connects an individual to the network of other people who have known them, spoken to them, called them something specific and personal. A case number has no such connection. A case number is a unit of administrative record. It exists in the file and nowhere else. He has not spoken to anyone who knew his name in 26 years. He will not speak to anyone who knows his name for another 60. Year 58. There is a particular quality to the cell at the time that is not quite night. The environmental cycle dims the lumens on an irregular schedule, a deliberate irregularity that has long since lost its capacity to disorient him, but still marks the periods when the facility is at its quietest. In this period, in the 58th year, he sits with his back against the wall and does something he has not done in a long time. He tries to remember Trajan's face. He cannot. This requires a moment. He has the memory. He knows he has the memory. The apothecarium's enhancements include a mnemonic capacity well in excess of baseline human recall, and the memories of his pre-detention career are not gone. He can access them. He can access the Beta Arcturus campaign in detail, the tactical dispositions, the Eldar's movement vectors, the specific sequence of the Autarch's duel, the coordinates of the killing ground. He can access Trajan's presence in those memories, the shape of him in the formation, the sound of his voice transmitting orders over the vox, the specific weight of his authority in a briefing, the way he moved in close combat. The face will not come. He tries for 3 hours. He retrieves everything adjacent to it. He cannot retrieve the face itself. The narrator says it plainly, because plainness is the only register that will not diminish it. This is what a century does. It does not take your memories. It takes the edges. It takes the human parts, the specific texture of a man's face, the exact quality of a person's laugh, the particular way a brother's presence felt in a space, the irreducibly individual thing that makes one person different from every other person and cannot be reduced to data. It leaves you with the function. It strips away the form. You retain the tactical record and you lose the human being, and you sit in a cell in the 58th year and you try to find the face of the man who made you what you are, and what you find instead is the absence of it. He sits with that absence for the rest of the cycle. He does not make a sound. Year 73. He stops speaking during questioning, not as defiance. He wants to be precise about this, because defiance would be something. Defiance would be a form of relationship with the process, a decision to refuse, an active choice that would mean the process still has enough purchase on him to be worth resisting. This is not that. This is exhaustion of a specific kind. He has given every answer he has. He has said "I don't know" in every formulation available to him. He has provided the same honest account of the same events in the same detail for 7 decades. And the account has not changed because the truth has not changed, and he has never said anything other than the truth, and the truth has not been sufficient to produce any outcome except more questions. He has nothing left to say. He sits in the sessions in silence. The Inquisitor, the third one by now, a sharp-faced man who approaches the questioning with the clinical efficiency of someone who has been told the case is a low priority and is trying to complete his obligation to it in minimum time. Notes in his session report: subject has become uncooperative. The narrator reads that line. The narrator reads that line again. Uncooperative. The man who was found in an access tunnel following the sound of a faulty coupling because it was the right thing to do. The man who stood in front of Marneus Calgar and received the captaincy of the second company with exactly the same quality of focused attention he gave to every assignment. The man who spent 70 years answering the same question honestly, repeatedly, without deviation, in a cell designed to break him, and could not break because there was nothing to break, because he had nothing to hide, and nothing to confess, and nothing to give, except the truth. And the truth was not what anyone was asking for. Uncooperative. Year 91. Thrax comes back. He is older, not as old as 100 years should make him. There have been juvenate treatments, the evidence of them visible in the specific way his aging has been interrupted and resumed, the face and the hands not matching the eyes. He sits across the table from Titus, and he looks at him for a long time, and Titus looks back, and the silence between them has a different quality to the silence of the sessions. It is not interrogative silence, not the silence of a question waiting for an answer. It is the silence of two people who have spent a very long time in a specific relationship and have arrived, independently, at the same exhausted recognition. Thrax says, "I still don't know what you are." Titus looks at him. The face across the table is older than the face he remembers from Greya, and the gap between those two faces is 100 years of a cell and a question without an answer. He says, "Neither do I." Thrax stands. He looks at Titus for one more moment with an expression that contains, if you study it, the specific quality of a man who has spent a century being certain and has arrived, without expecting to, at the place where certainty runs out. Then he leaves. He does not return for another 6 years. Year 97. Titus finds an insect in a crack in the cell wall. It is dead. Something small. The taxonomy is not important. The specific classification of this creature in the biological catalogues of the facility's origin world is not what matters. What matters is that it is there, in a facility designed for total containment, in a cell maintained at the specifications required to prevent any biological contamination that could be weaponized or used as a communication vector. Something very small has lived and died in a crack in the wall. He picks it up. He holds it in his palm, the palm that no longer carries the calluses of a boy who worked soil processors on Tarantis, but has its own history of calluses now, the different history of a different life. He looks at it.
The narrator does not tell you what he is thinking.
The silence is the explanation. Hold it. Stay inside it. Look at the dead insect in the palm of the man who has been in this cell for 97 years, and ask yourself what it means to find, in a place designed to contain everything. Something that got in anyway. Something that lived here without permission. Something the system could not account for. Something small. Something that should not have survived. In the 101st year, a form was completed. Not an exoneration. Not a review board's finding of innocence. Not an apology. Not an acknowledgement. Not a single word that addressed the question of what had been done to the man in the cell, or whether that thing had been justified or proportionate or correct. A form, an administrative document generated by a mid-level analyst reviewing a portfolio of age detentions in the context of a new operational requirement. A threat in a sector adjacent to Ultramar that required assets, and a review of available assets, and a calculation about the cost-to-value ratio of maintaining the detention of a space marine captain of the second company who had been held for a century without charge and whose file had been flagged as low active risk in the last 17 consecutive assessments. The form recommended release pending ongoing monitoring. The form was countersigned by a senior inquisitor who had not been born when Titus was arrested and had not read the underlying file and had no context for the case beyond the summary provided by the analyst. The door opened. No apology. No acknowledgement. No explanation of what had been determined, or why the determination had changed, or what 100 years in a cell without charge was supposed to mean in the broader accounting of the Imperium's relationship with its servants. The forms were completed. The door opened. A warden, young, efficient, entirely without context, led him through a series of corridors to a transit point. He walked out into a corridor that smelled of recycled air and promethium, and nothing that he recognized. He had been inside for 100 years. The Imperium had not noticed him leave. It had not noticed him return. He stood in the corridor for 11 minutes without moving. The warden filed it as a behavioral anomaly, a detained subject requiring post-release acclimatization assessment, a box to tick, a form to complete. Standard protocol for long-term detentions. Nothing unusual. He was not processing the light. He had been in the light before. The facility cycled its lumens. He was not overwhelmed by brightness. He was not processing the space, the particular quality of an unconfined area after a century in a cell. He was not, in any observable sense, doing the things that post-release anomaly protocols are designed to address. He was remembering, not the mission, not the tactics, not the codex. He was remembering a world called Beta Arcturus. He was remembering a killing ground and a young battle brother pulled from it, and the specific calculation of what that rescue had cost. He was remembering the weight of Trajan's body carried back to Macraga. He was remembering the face of the warrior who had stood at his side in the aftermath of the campaign, who had delivered the post-engagement report with the competence and correctness that had always distinguished him, whose expression he had always read as admiration. He was remembering that Leandros had been the last person standing beside him before the arrest. He was remembering the irregularity of the timeline, the speed of Thrax's arrival, the specificity of the charges, the quality of the intelligence that the ordo malleus retinue had arrived with, the particular certainty of a man who has received a report rather than conducted an observation. He was doing something he had not done in a very long time, something the cell had not been able to take from him despite a century of trying, something that the system had drilled into him and the system had been unable to drill back out. He was thinking. And in the 11 minutes of stillness in a corridor that smelled of nothing, he recognized the shape of what had happened. Not the full picture, not yet, not with the specific evidence that would confirm it. But the shape of it was assembling itself in the analytical architecture of a mind that had been a weapon for a century and a half, and had, for 100 years, been given nothing to cut. It had found something now. The warden noted the 11 minutes, filed the form, moved on. Titus stood in the corridor, and somewhere in the Imperium, in a chapter that had stopped mourning him before the first decade of his absence was done, in a vessel where a nameplate had been removed and a bunk had been assigned to someone who never knew its history, a question was beginning to form that no one had thought to prepare an answer for. The question was not, why did you survive? That question had been asked 4,000 times and had produced nothing. This question was different. This question was his. He began very quietly to ask it. Chapter 5. The shape of what remains. You asked a question at the beginning of this story. Do you remember it? I asked it before I told you anything. Before Tarantis, before the trials, before the surgeries and the campaigns, and the man who died on Beta Arcturus, and the man who didn't die above Greya, and the 100 years in between. I asked it over an empty throne and a nameplate in a corridor that no one lingered in. And I told you we would not be able to answer it until the end. We are at the end. The question was this: what does a man become when the only thing that ever defined him was his willingness to serve, and the thing he served decided he never existed? Here is your answer. He becomes the question the Imperium cannot answer. He becomes the thing that survived, not just the warp, not just the fall from the spire, not just 100 years in a cell designed to unmake him, but the thing that survived being decided against. He becomes the proof, walking and breathing and functional, that the system's logic had a gap in it, that the math, which was always correct, had been applied to the wrong variable. And in a system built on certainty, on hierarchy, and the absolute conviction that every anomaly is a threat, that the unexplained is the dangerous, that the thing which does not fit the classification must be forced into one regardless of the cost. There is nothing more dangerous than a man who proved the system wrong simply by continuing to breathe. He is standing in front of the throne now. The same throne, the same ship, the righteous fury, because the Imperium's vessels outlast the people who serve on them and ask no questions about the history of the spaces they contain. The throne that sat empty for 100 years, while the nameplate was removed and the position was filled and the chapter rolled forward without him. He is standing in front of it, and he is not sitting in it. Not yet, perhaps not ever. That question belongs to a story that has not been told, and the narrator is looking at him and trying to find the words for what he has become. He is not broken. That is the first thing. The thing that confounds people who look at him now, who know enough of the history to understand what 100 years in that cell should have produced. They look at him expecting to see the specific damage of it, the particular quality of a man who has been through something that should have destroyed him and hasn't quite. The fracture lines, the places where the structure held but only barely, the marks that long trauma leaves on even the most resilient organisms. They do not find what they are looking for. What they find instead is harder to name. The floor of him is solid. That is the closest approximation. He went all the way down. 100 years of questions with no answers, of isolation so complete that the edges of other people's faces blurred and dissolved, of an institution's entire weight applied to the project of determining what he was. And he found at the bottom of all of it that the floor was there. He did not fall through. He did not shatter on impact. He reached the floor, and the floor held, and he stood on it. What came back up is not what went down. You cannot spend 100 years at the floor of yourself and return to the surface unchanged. But what changed is not what the cell intended to change. The cell intended erosion, the slow dissolution of identity, the gradual replacement of selfhood with the simpler, more manageable category of a detained subject with a case number. What it produced instead was reduction of a different kind, a burning away, a process by which everything in him that was not essential was consumed by the duration, and what remained was the essential things, clarified and stripped of everything that had been attached to them by circumstance or habit or the particular noise of a life lived inside an institution. What remained was this: a man who knew what he was. Not what he was in the Inquisition's classification, not what he was in the chapter's record, or Calgar's assessment, or the file that Thrax had kept for a century. What he was in the oldest, most irreducible sense. The quality that had been present in an access tunnel on Tarantis, before anyone had found him and decided what to make of him. The thing that looked at danger and assessed it and asked without performance, "Should I be afraid?" That thing was intact. The people who look at him now and find something they cannot name, what they are finding is that quality unadorned. 100 years of everything else removed. The thing underneath, visible for the first time because there is nothing left to obscure it. Whether that is the greatest testament to what the Ultramarines built, or the most thorough indictment of it, the narrator genuinely cannot tell you. Both interpretations hold. Both are true simultaneously. This is the specific quality of Titus's survival that makes it not triumphant but devastating. He is the proof that the system works, and the proof that the system is wrong, in exactly the same moment, in exactly the same person. He learned what Leandros had done over the course of 3 weeks. Not from the Inquisition. They provided nothing, acknowledged nothing, offered no accounting of the process that had produced his detention, or the evidence on which it had been based. The forms were completed, the door had opened. Their obligation to him, in their assessment of it, had been fully discharged. He learned it the way that a man with 100 years of enforced patience and a clarified, essential mind learns anything. Methodically, from the available evidence, following each thread to its source, and then following the source to its origin. He requested access to records. Some requests were declined, others were processed. Some of the declined requests told him as much as the processed ones. The specific shape of what the Inquisition would not show him was itself a form of information, a negative space that outlined what was there. He assembled the picture, piece by piece. The transmission log from the Righteous Fury in the 47-minute window between the end of the Spire engagement and Thrax's first hail. The specific content of the flag that had caused the dormant file to be reopened. A flag that could only have been generated by someone with direct knowledge of his conduct during the campaign. Someone who had observed the warp exposure at close range. The timing of Leandros' assignment to the Second Company in the years after Beta Arcturus. Not random rotation, he found, but a specific placement recommended by an Inquisitorial liaison to the chapter's administrative office, filed under a cross-agency cooperation protocol that no one had questioned because the chapter's administrative office processed these requests in volume and did not review each one individually. Leandros had not been assigned to him by accident. Leandros had been assigned to him because the file opened by an unnamed assessor in the 43rd year of his service, containing a single line about a sergeant who was exceptional and recommended for monitoring, had eventually reached a desk that decided monitoring required a presence, an observer, someone in the company who would watch and report, someone whose own convictions about doctrine and protocol could be relied upon to produce the right kind of observation. The file had been building toward this for decades before Titus had any idea it existed. He sat with this knowledge the way he sat with everything now, with the particular stillness of the floor of himself. He did not rage. Not because he did not feel the thing that rage is the expression of. He felt it, precisely and fully, the way he had always felt things, without the dampening of denial or the distance of dissociation. He felt it, and he held it, and he did not let it determine his next action. Because he had been built not to let feeling determine action without the mediation of thought, and the cell had not taken that from him. He did not break down, not because the knowledge did not warrant it, because breaking down was not a function he had available. He sat with it, and he understood it, and he let the understanding settle into the same place that everything else had settled over 100 years, and then he was ready for the next thing. "I see it," he said to himself, in the particular interior register he had been speaking in for a century. "I understand it. I know what he did." That was all. That was sufficient. The accounting had been made. The ledger was clear. What came next was not his to decide alone, but he was not yet ready to think about what came next. There was one more thing he needed to see. The record of Leandros' career in the century of Titus's absence reads like the career the Imperium writes for its ideal products. He was promoted to sergeant within 3 years of the Greya campaign. He received his first independent command, a kill team deployment in the Ghoul Star's periphery, within 8, and the after-action report filed by the senior officer overseeing the operation cited his tactical application of codex doctrine as exemplary and his unit cohesion as exceptional. He was awarded the Crux Terminatus in his 17th year of post-Greya service, during a campaign whose details are classified, but whose outcome, a defended world, a broken chaos warband, minimal casualties relative to the threat level, is noted in the chapter's accessible records as a significant victory. He was, by every available measure, an outstanding Space Marine. He served with distinction on campaigns that Titus had commanded before him, theaters of operation that the chapter returned to across the decades, where the ground had been prepared by the Second Company's previous work, where Titus's tactical decisions had shaped the conditions that Leandros now operated in. He walked through rooms that Titus had cleared. He held lines that Titus had established. He was celebrated, in at least 2 campaign summaries accessible to the public record, for the quality of his judgment in theaters where his predecessor's groundwork was, unbeknownst to those doing the celebrating, visible in every position the enemy occupied. He never spoke of Titus publicly. Not once, in 100 years of service, in 100 after-action reports and tactical assessments and chapter ceremonial addresses did the name appear. He did not expunge it. That would have required acknowledgement of its existence. He simply never included it. He spoke of the Second Company's history in the way that all institutional history eventually speaks of its inconvenient chapters, by beginning the story from a point after the inconvenience. He never gloated. This is important, because gloating would have been something. Gloating would have implied that there was a contest, that there had been 2 sides, that one had won and one had lost. Leandros operated from a framework in which there were no sides and no contest. There was the codex and the protocol, and the correct execution of both, and he had executed both correctly, and that was the end of it. He felt no visible guilt. This requires the longest pause in the chapter, and I am going to give it to you. Not the pause of disbelief. The story has been building to this portrait for 5 chapters, and nothing in it should surprise you. The pause of recognition. Because the thing that Leandros represents, the thing that makes him the coldest horror in a story full of cold horrors, is not that he was an aberration. It is that he was an outcome. The Imperium did not produce Leandros despite its values. It produced him through them. Take the codex as absolute authority. Take doctrine as the terminal reference. Remove the space in which personal judgment is permitted to operate, because personal judgment is the pathway by which good warriors become dangerous ones. Remove it thoroughly enough, early enough, completely enough, and what you produce is a man for whom the question of whether an action is right is fully answered by the question of whether the rulebook sanctions it. The rulebook sanctioned it. He had no reservations about the outcome. These words come from a personal log. A record kept irregularly across his career, recovered through channels that the narrator will not specify because the specificity would implicate people still living, and found among the documents made available to Titus in the weeks after his release. Most of the log's entries are tactical in nature, observations about engagements, assessments of terrain, notes on the conduct of subordinates that would later appear, refined and formalized, in his official after-action reports. There is one entry that is not tactical. It is dated to the week after the Greya campaign. It is 3 sentences long. It reads, in full, "The captain showed signs inconsistent with sanctioned behavior. I reported accurately and according to protocol. I have no reservations about the outcome." The narrator reads it once, then reads it again. No reservations. Not I acted as I believed was right. Not I acted despite the personal cost. Not even the hollow absolution of I had no choice. No reservations. The clean, satisfied language of a man completing a form he has filled out correctly. The specific vocabulary of a system that has processed a case and found its own procedures adequate. That is what a cold man sounds like. Not a monster. Monsters are comprehensible. Monsters have appetites and impulses that locate them in the recognizable register of things gone wrong. Not a sociopath. The sociopath is damaged, is absent something that should be present, is definable by what is missing. This is something different. This is a man who was complete, intact, functioning precisely as designed. A man who read the rulebook, found that the rulebook agreed with him, executed its provisions correctly, and experienced not relief, not conflict resolved, not the complicated piece of a hard decision made, but satisfaction. The uncomplicated satisfaction of a system functioning correctly. The Imperium made Leandros too. It just made him to different specifications. The question that Thrax asked for 100 years remains unanswered. This is not an oversight. This is not a loose thread that the story failed to resolve. I want to be direct with you about this, because you have listened to 5 chapters and you have earned directness. The question is unanswered because the question cannot be answered. Not by Titus, not by the narrator, not by the ordo malleus with a century of interrogation and all the instruments available to an inquisition that has been studying warp phenomena since before the Horus heresy. Why did he survive? There is something in him. There has always been something in him, present in the tunnel on Tarantis, present in the trials, present in the surgeries that took everything else and left this, present in every campaign and every engagement and every moment when the thing inside him assessed a situation and said with a quietness that was not courage, but something older than courage, I see it. I understand it. I know what to do. It pushed back against the warp, quietly, constitutionally, without drama or display. The warp pressed and the thing inside him said no, and it kept saying no. And the warp, the accumulated hunger of the immaterium, the force that unmakes minds and corrupts flesh, and has consumed things greater than any space marine who ever lived, found, in that quiet no, something it could not get purchase on. Imperial science cannot classify it. The ordo malleus has no entry for it. The codex astartes, the great repository of everything the ultramarines know about how to be what they are, has no chapter that addresses it. The horror of the Imperium is not that it destroyed him out of malice. The Imperium is not capable of malice in the meaningful sense. Malice requires the recognition of another person's humanity, the decision to act against it anyway, the specific cruelty of the deliberate. The Imperium is not cruel. It is something worse. It is correct. Unexplained survival is potential corruption. Potential corruption is unacceptable risk. Unacceptable risk requires elimination. The logic is sound. The premises are drawn from 10,000 years of observing what the warp does to the strongest warriors in the galaxy, of watching incorruptible men become corrupted, of learning the hardest possible lesson about the price of insufficient caution. The math is not wrong. The math is always correct. It just does not know what to do with Titus. The narrator asks you something and asks it seriously, without rhetorical shelter. If you were Thrax, not a villain, not a sadist, but an inquisitor of the ordo malleus who has spent a career watching the warp consume the best that humanity produces, what would you have done? If a space marine captain survived direct warp exposure without corruption, without explanation, without any mechanism that your classification system can account for, what would you have done? If your honest answer is the same thing, then you understand the Imperium. You understand why it endures. You understand what 10,000 years of survival in a universe that is actively trying to end the human species costs. What the price of that endurance looks like in the specific currency of individual lives consumed by the logic of institutional necessity. You understand what it costs, and understanding it does not make it right, and understanding it does not make it wrong. And this tension, this specific irresolvable tension between the logic that keeps humanity alive and the cost of that logic in the lives of the people the logic is supposed to protect. This is not a problem with a solution. This is the Imperium of man. This is what it is. This is what it has always been. Captain Titus knew this. He knows it now with a clarity that 100 years in a cell has stripped of every comfortable ambiguity, and he serves anyway. The armor goes on in pieces, not his original armor. That was catalogued and stored and eventually stripped for parts in the 3rd decade of his detention. The components redistributed to the chapter's armory reserves in the same administrative process that reassigned his bunk and removed his nameplate. This armor is new or newly assigned, the particular blue of the Ultramarines applied over ceramite that carries the marks of a previous owner, a warrior whose name is not Titus, but whose armor now is. It fits. Space Marine armor is calibrated to the wearer's dimensions during the bonding process, and the process does not care about the history of the body it is bonding to. He puts it on in the sequence the apothecarium taught him, the order that has not changed in a century and a half of wearing power armor, that his hands remember without being asked to remember. That is deeper in him than almost anything else that remains. Greaves first, then the leg plates, then the torso section, the gorget, the pauldrons, each piece locking into place with the specific sounds of well-maintained ceramite, the pressurization cycling, the systems initializing in the particular sequence that his enhanced senses have catalogued 10,000 times. He picks up the sword last. He holds it for a moment. Not dramatically. He is incapable of drama in the theatrical sense. The cell has burned whatever residual capacity for performance he might once have had. He holds it because it is the weight he is about to carry, and he wants to feel the weight before he carries it. He wants to be honest with himself, in the way he has always been honest with himself, about what he is choosing. He is choosing to go back, not to the chapter that erased him, or not only to that, not in the simple sense of institutional restoration and the resumption of rank. He is choosing to go back to the work, the specific work that his particular combination of qualities equips him to do, the close engagement, the direct experience, the willingness to face the thing at point-blank range rather than through the mediated safety of a data report. The work of a man who has been inside the worst things the galaxy produces and has come back from all of them with his essential self intact and his understanding deepened. There are things in the galaxy that need to be faced by someone who cannot be broken by them. He has established conclusively, through a methodology that cost him a century and was not of his choosing, that he is such a person. This is not forgiveness. The narrator wants to be precise about this. What Titus is doing as he puts on the armor and picks up the sword and turns toward the corridor is not the act of a man who has forgiven an institution its 100-year crime against him. Forgiveness requires the acknowledgement of the wrong by the party that committed it, and the Imperium has not acknowledged anything. It opened a door. It completed a form. It has moved on to the next case. This is not resignation either, not the defeated return of a man who has run out of alternatives and accepts the only available option. He has alternatives. He has survived things that would have killed lesser men, and he has emerged clarified and functional, and entirely capable of making a choice that is not this one. He is making this choice because it is the right one, not for the Imperium. The Imperium does not require his forgiveness, and does not deserve his loyalty in the abstract sense that loyalty is a gift given to the worthy. He is not going back because the Imperium has earned it. He is going back because the work needs doing, because there are worlds in the dark that need someone standing between them and what is coming. Because the alternative, walking away from the armor, walking away from the sword, walking away from the function he was built for and has spent a lifetime perfecting, is to leave the wall unmanned. And the things on the other side of the wall do not pause for his grievance. They do not wait while he decides whether the institution that placed him on the wall deserves his continued presence on it. They come regardless, and so he goes back. The narrator watches him walk away, down the corridor, away from the throne, away from the nameplate that has been replaced, and the history that has been partially restored, and the institutional record that will forever carry the gap of 100 years that no administrative document can fully account for. He walks with the measured, even step of a man who has arrived at a decision and is moving toward its execution. His armor is perfect. His posture is perfect. He does not look back, not at the throne, not at the narrator, not at you. He is already somewhere else in his attention, already in the work, already being, with the totality that has always been the most fundamental thing about him, exactly what he is. I have been sitting with this story for a long time. I have been sitting with the question of what to say to you at its end, what the last thing should be, what note to leave you on, what the correct register is for the closing of something that does not close. Because it doesn't, does it? The story of Titus does not have an ending in the way that satisfying stories have endings, where the threads are gathered, and the wound is either healed or acknowledged, and the audience is given the specific emotional release of a thing concluded. The wound is still open. The system is still running. The throne has a new nameplate now, and the corridor has people in it who do not know the history of the floor they walk on, and the Imperium is still, in its vast, grinding, 10,000-year way, doing exactly what it was built to do: processing, continuing, consuming what it needs and erasing what it cannot classify, and rolling forward on the momentum of institutional certainty that does not ask whether its logic is just, only whether its logic is sound. The math is always correct. Titus walks back into it, knowing what it is, knowing what it cost, knowing that the question Thrax asked him for 100 years is still unanswered, that the file is still open somewhere in the Inquisitorial network, that the thing inside him that said no to the warp has not been explained and will not be explained, and that its inexplicability will, for as long as he lives, make him a subject of interest to people whose institutional function is to treat unexplained things as threats. He knows all of this. He walks back anyway. The Imperium of Man was built by giants and maintained by believers, and it will, in the end, consume everything that makes it worth saving. It has always worked exactly as intended. Captain Titus knew that, and served anyway. Tell me, is that loyalty, or is that the saddest thing in the galaxy? I have thought about it for a long time. I still don't know. I suspect that is the point. Silence. This is the tragedy of Captain Titus in the Warhammer 40k universe, produced by VoidBorne Terrors.